Okay, so let's dive right into one of the most complex and controversial policies out there, the U.S. government's targeted killing program. It's a wild story of secret databases, laws that get redefined, and, life or death decisions being made deep in the shadows of the war on terror.
And really, it all boils down to this one, almost unthinkable question. And this isn't some hypothetical from a spy movie. It's a real thing that forces us to look at our core legal principles. And the answer, as we're about to see, is a definite yes. It can happen, and it has happened.
To really get our heads around how this works, we need to look at the case of one specific man, Anwar al-Awlaki. He was an American-born cleric who became a senior operational leader for al-Qaeda, and eventually a target of his very own government.
So, who exactly was Anwar al-Awlaki, and how in the world does an American citizen end up in the crosshairs of a U.S. drone?
We'll get this. He was born in New Mexico. For a while, he was actually a pretty prominent cleric right here in the United States. But later, he became a key figure in AQAP, links to a bunch of different terror plots against the West. And then, in September 2011, he was killed by a U.S. drone strike in Yemen. His journey, from an American preacher to a name on a kill list, it just begs that fundamental question. What kind of system even makes an action like that possible? So how is a decision like this even made? To understand that, we've got to look at the machine behind the targeting, this incredibly sophisticated database known as the disposition matrix.
This thing was developed around 2010, and it was designed to be much more than just a simple list of targets. It catalogs everything: biographies, locations, who's connected to who, all to streamline the process to track, capture, or, yes, kill. The whole point was to make targeted killing a permanent official part of U.S. counterterrorism policy.
And this just perfectly highlights the gap between the bureaucratic name and what it actually does. I mean, the official term is disposition matrix, but as the Washington Post reported, everybody knows what it really is. Informally, it's just called a kill list.
The whole process is incredibly centralized. It starts with the National Counterterrorism Center. They're the ones generating the names. Then those names get reviewed by a whole bunch of intelligence and military folks. But, and this is the key part, the final decision to use lethal force against someone outside of a normal war zone, that rests with the President of the United States. Okay, so that's the how. But here's the crucial part. How does the government legally justify targeting and killing people, including its own citizens, without any kind of trial?
While the legal argument was laid out in a now famous Department of Justice white paper, and it all comes down to this three-part test. First, the target has to be an imminent threat of a violent attack. Second, capturing them has to be infeasible. And third, the strike has to follow the laws of war.
Now this is where it gets really interesting. That term, imminent threat. You'd think that means someone is about to launch an attack, like right now. But no, the government basically expanded the definition. It no longer requires clear proof of a specific immediate attack. Instead, it covers someone's continual plotting. And that is a huge shift because it moves the justification from a specific, provable threat to a much more abstract, predictive judgment about what someone might do.
And President Obama himself defended this policy in a big speech, using this exact analogy. His argument was that if a U.S. citizen is actively waging war against America, their citizenship can't act like a magical shield from military action. But, as you can imagine, that justification is, well, it's far from settled. In fact, it kicked off this fierce debate that gets right to the heart of that classic American dilemma, security versus liberty. So on one side, you have the supporters, U.S. officials, and studies like one from the RAND Corporation, who say the program is a legal, effective tool that literally saves lives by stopping attacks before they happen. But on the other side, you've got critics from the ACLU all the way to the UN who argue that this is just a way to get around due process. They say it creates a secret system of execution without a trial that might even be a war crime. President Obama's own defense was super direct and clear. For his administration, the main argument was that when you're fighting a shadowy enemy, targeted strikes are the most precise and effective way to prevent attacks and protect American lives. Simple as that. But in sharp contrast, the ACLU argued that this whole thing, which was originally sold as a narrow, emergency-only exception, was just becoming a normal part of U.S. policy. And they warned that that creates a really dangerous precedent for extrajudicial killing, far from any traditional battlefield.
But let's move beyond the legal memos and the policy debates in Washington. This program has profound, real-world consequences for the people who are actually living under the constant threat of these drones.
And this is where the policy gets really messy. Reports from places like Pakistan and Yemen, they paint a very different picture. Even President Obama admitted to the heartbreaking tragedies of civilian deaths. And critics argue that this collateral damage, plus the constant climate of fear it creates, it risks fueling extremism and actually creating more enemies than it eliminates. That's a strategic cost that's incredibly hard to measure.
Ultimately, this brings us right back to that central dilemma. When you're facing a threat that has no clear end and no defined battlefield, the challenge isn't just about security. It's about who you are. How does a nation defend itself without sacrificing the very principles of justice and law that it was built on? That is the question, and there's still no easy answer.